Italian artist Salvatore Garau has proven that anything is possible in art. His invisible sculpture, I Aim, was auctioned off for a sum 2.5 times higher than the starting price. But what did the lucky buyer actually purchase? Nothing. Or, more precisely, a pure idea. Garau insists that his work does exist. It is woven from energy, power, and thoughts, and it requires a space of 1.5 by 1.5 meters, as well as complete freedom of imagination. Instead of a physical object, the buyer received only a certificate. Such a fragile confirmation of ownership of something that does not exist. And, perhaps this is the most vivid illustration of what is actually sold on the contemporary art market. So today, let's discuss what contemporary art actually is, who buys it, and who creates it. And I'm Katerina Kirgoreva. Don't forget to like, leave comments, and subscribe to the private channels, thanks to which this project exists in the first place. And that's the foundation upon foundation. In his famous book, The 12 Million Stuffed Shark, Don Thompson offered a working definition of contemporary art. The work must stand in opposition to tradition and be created after the 1970s. So, contemporary art is not just something made by our contemporaries. What really matters here is its non-traditional nature, which actually confuses most viewers. And it really is strange to hear claims that Andy Warhol's urine on metal plates or elephant dung in Chrysophilly's works are considered contemporary art. While realistic portraits by lesser-known artists are supposedly something entirely different, there's a branch of philosophy called aesthetics. It examines the essence and forms of beauty in artistic creation, in nature, and in life. It considers art as a special form of social consciousness. Marxist aesthetics, which is based on dialectical materialism, notes that form must be meaningful and content must be given form. A work of art is a reflection of the mastery that humanity has achieved at a certain stage of its development. That is, from a technical point of view, works develop, becoming increasingly skillful. They reflect reality ever better through the author's lens. This is the form, but without content it is empty. The content of art reflects the progressive tendencies of its time. This can be expressed in different ways through the rejection of the obsolete, the affirmation of the advanced. It can be more or less transient, like the beauty of nature or a scene of a fight in a tavern. But form without content is dead. And this can be discussed at length, raising questions about the beautiful, the ugly, art for art's sake, and so on. But today, let's focus specifically on contemporary art, which, according to aesthetics, is actually not art at all, despite its name. And let's look at this phenomenon from the perspective of economics and the market. After all, these are the questions of money that interest us the most. And let's start with contemporary artists whose works are sold at the world's most prestigious auctions, Christie's, Sotheby's for tens of millions of dollars. What is it about these paintings that makes collectors pay such insane amounts of money for them? Take Andy Warhol, for example, is perhaps the most prominent figure in the history of pop art and one of the first artists who managed to turn himself into an art object. His story is not just a path to fame, it is a carefully constructed myth in which art, fashion, advertising, and mass culture are intertwined into an inseparable whole. Andy Warhol was born in 1928 in Pittsburgh to a family of immigrants from Austria-Hungary. After falling ill as a child, he was bedridden and spent his time cutting out images from magazines. This was his early immersion in visual culture, which he would later elevate to the level of art. After graduating from the Carnegie Institute of Technology, Warhol moved to New York and began his career as a successful illustrator for advertising agencies. It was at that time that he simplified his last name, dropping the final letter from Warhola to become Warhol. However, the true story of Andy Warhol began in the early 1960s when he moved beyond applied graphics and started creating what would soon be called pop art. Initially, no one took his work seriously. The gallerist Leo Castelli rejected his offer to exhibit, considering his style unoriginal, and even his attempt to donate a drawing of shoes to the Museum of Modern Art, the famous MoMA, ended in failure. The museum simply returned the work. But the real turning point came in 1962, when Warhol created a series of 32 canvases depicting Campbell's soup cans. You've surely seen them. They were exhibited in Los Angeles by Irving Blum, the director of the Firus Gallery. Each can was priced at $100, and the arrangement on white shelves along the gallery walls resembled supermarket shelves. A neighboring gallery inadvertently supported Warhol by displaying a pyramid of real soup cans in its window, accompanied by the ironic slogan, "We have the real ones for just 29 cents." This was not just an exhibition, it was an act that undermined the boundary between art and commodity. And there are several versions of how exactly the sales of these soup cans went. According to one version, Blum sold only 6 works, one of them to actor Dennis Hopper, but then decided that the series should remain intact and bought all the paintings back. He offered Warhol $1,000 for the entire set, paying $100 a month. According to another version, Blum did not sell a single one, but still promised Warhol success. Years later, in 1995, the same set was bought by the same MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, for $14,500 million. But why soup cans specifically? Well, Warhol stated that canned food is a very accurate metaphor for a consumer society obsessed with mass production. He even said that he would depict whichever flavor sold more often, whether it was tomato or chicken soup. His silkscreens were perceived as replicas of advertisements, but once they entered the gallery, their meaning changed. Viewers could no longer treat them as ordinary images of packaging. Then came a series of celebrity portraits: Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, Elizabeth Taylor, Jackie Kennedy. Warhol used the silkscreen technique. He transferred enlarged and multiplied photographs onto canvas, often varying the colors and adding brushstrokes to create minimal differences between the prints. These works carried a tragic undertone. Monroe was already dead, Taylor was struggling with addictions, and the images of Jackie were accompanied by the context of her husband's assassination. With each portrait, Warhol not only captured popular iconography, but also heightened the sense of repetition and tragedy inherent in mass culture. Later, he turned to darker themes. In the disaster series, he reproduced images from newspapers. These included car crashes, poisonings, and suicides. In the work White Disaster from 1963, the body of a girl who jumped from the roof of the Empire State Building is depicted. These images are repeated like a news cycle. Death becomes reproducible. In 1963, Warhol opens a factory studio where his assistants essentially create art on an assembly line. Warhol openly states that art can be produced like a commodity. I think it would be great if no one knew whether a painting was mine or someone else's. He delegates silkscreen printing to print shops, claiming that he doesn't want to do things that are too complicated. It was the factory and mass production that defined the future of art. After all, after Warhol's death in 1987, people, of course, continued to profit from him. That's when the question arose, which of these works are truly authentic Warhols? In the early 2000s, a commission was even established called the Andy Warhol Art Authentication Board. Its task was to determine which works could be considered genuine. And you know what the funniest part is? The criterion wasn't whether Warhol himself had a hand in these works. No. The board determined whether Warhol had even seen or was aware of the existence of these works. In fact, after Warhol, contemporary art essentially turned into a conveyor belt and, stopped being art. Just like machines, clothing, and candy are produced in factories, paintings can be produced in exactly the same way. And what is the main goal for any commercial enterprise? Maximizing profit by reducing costs and increasing selling prices. In the same way, an artist tries to spend as little effort and time as possible creating their works and to set the highest possible price thanks to their own name. And some have managed to do this brilliantly. Take Damian Hurst, for example. He started with cardboard boxes, painted with house paint, and ended up with a platinum skull encrusted with diamonds. Between those points were a shark in formaldehyde, decomposing cow heads, cabinets filled with pills, and paintings he didn't paint himself. Damian Hurst is a man who proved that genius can be put on an assembly line. So in 1991, Charles Saatchi, the legendary collector and patron, had already noticed the young rebel after his audacious frieze exhibition. But what Hurst showed him next blew up the art world. In a giant aquarium floated a tiger shark, dead, suspended in formaldehyde. The title of the work sounded like a challenge, the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living. I like the idea of something that scares you. It's bigger than you. You don't know what substance it's floating in. It looks alive even though it's dead, which means that even dead, it's alive. That's how beautifully Hurst spoke about this shark. Critics argued whether it was genius or just simple provocation. But when, in 2005, the work was sold for $12 million, it became clear art would never be the same again. Hurst grew up in Leeds, in a family far removed from the bohemian world. His father repaired cars, and his mother was passionate about painting. He wasn't accepted into art school. Later, critics enthusiastically talked about this fact, saying that Hurst was so unconventional that he didn't fit into the stifling confines of that art school. But Goldsmiths College, where he was eventually admitted, became a springboard for him. It should be noted that this college specialized precisely in creating works that stood in opposition to classical art. It was there that Hurst understood the main thing. Art is not about skill, but about the idea. And it's definitely not about modesty. Simply put, it's not necessary to create something talented. It's much more important to build your own brand and sell it skillfully. In 1988, he organized that very frieze exhibition I mentioned at the beginning in an abandoned building at the London docks. Among the participants were future stars like Sarah Lucas and Gary Hume. But the main discovery was Hurst himself. He actually has several types of works. These are the spot paintings, the spin paintings, the animals in formaldehyde, and the butterflies. Hurst doesn't paint his own pictures. And even in those where an artist's input is expected, like the spot paintings, his involvement is limited to giving instructions to his assistants. And Hurst doesn't even try to hide this. He says that out of everyone who painted dots for me, Rachel is the best. Here's his quote, literally, but it's his signature on the work. That's enough for the piece to be worth millions. In 2007, his Lullaby Springer cabinet with 6 136 pills set a record, 19.1 million at Sotheby's. Later, Jeff Koons surpassed him, but not for long. The year 2007? Yes, we're still talking about Hurst. In a dark room at the White Cube Gallery, a human skull stares at visitors. A real one. But it's not just a skull, it's made of platinum and set with 8 601 diamonds. And in fact, this skull was an exact replica of a real human skull that belonged to someone who lived in the 18th century. And in the center of the forehead, there is a pink diamond weighing 52 carats. For the love of God, that's what Hurst called the piece. When his mother found out about his idea, she exclaimed, "For the love of God." And that's exactly what most people will exclaim when they see any of Hurst's works, especially once they learn their price. 3 months later, the skull was bought for $50 million in cash. So, by the age of 42, Hurst had earned 130 million pounds. This is more than Picasso, Warhol, Dali at the same age. But Hurst and Warhol, whom we've discussed, were certainly not the only ones. We could also mention other artists, for example, Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Francis Bacon, Lucian Freud, Jeff Koons, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and many others. But the story, one way or another, will come down not to an examination of their works, but to the history of building their own brand. In essence, what they actually did doesn't matter. What matters is how and who made the decision to promote them and ultimately make millions from it. And by the way, I've talked about some exotic works that were sold for fabulous sums of money on my Telegram channel. Go check it out and be sure to subscribe. And as strange as it may sound, artists are far from being the main players in the contemporary art market. Dealers, auction houses, and art fairs play a much more significant role in it. I'll go even further. The simplicity and straightforwardness of contemporary art objects make their creators mere puppets in the hands of dealers. Careers can be destroyed with the snap of a finger, and yesterday's fame can instantly turn into oblivion. Especially if we're not talking about one of the few stars like Hurst or Warhol who can literally be counted on one hand. In the history of art, there have been many instances where the fate of an entire movement depended on just one or two people dealers whose taste and ambition determined which art would become popular and which would fade into oblivion. One of the first to turn art dealing into the art of influence was Joseph Henry Duveen, who was born in 1869 in Hull, England. He became the prototype of the modern branded dealer and managed to create a model that is still followed today. The 19th century was an era when feudal remnants still existed in the form of hereditary aristocracy, which made up high society. And the newly wealthy capitalists were very eager to join this society. Lacking refined taste, they were willing to spend enormous sums on home furnishings, paintings, and other signs of aristocratic status. And Duveen was a man who supplied America's early 20th century high society with paintings by the old masters. Moreover, he did this with such flair and charisma that his clients, capitalist giants like Rockefeller, Morgan, Henry Clay Frick, and Andrew Mellon never even questioned the price. And they were right not to, because Duveen knew his craft and could present each painting as something far greater than just a canvas. When you buy the priceless at a high price, you're practically getting it for free, he would say, knowing that for these people, attaining cultural status was what mattered most. He often sent works of art to his wealthy clients on a temporary basis so they could try them out in their interiors and lifestyles. And once, one of them even asked Duveen to appraise a painting that had been accidentally discovered at home. That's how much of an authority he had become in this society. And the boldest episode of his career was the sale of Thomas Gainsborough's painting, The Blue Boy. And do you know why? because it belonged to the Duke of Westminster, whom Duvain didn't even know. However, that didn't stop him from selling the painting for £182,000 sterling. At the time, that was about $750,000, and today it would be roughly $7.5 million. So he sold this painting to the heirs of the American railroad magnate Henry Huntington. And only after that did Duvain actually begin negotiations with the Duke himself, and after a couple of months he received consent to purchase. So in this way the painting was first sold and only then acquired. In addition, Duvain understood perfectly well that his clients wanted not only decorations for their homes, but also a place in society. He took them to museums, introduced them to respected trustees, organized visits to the estates of the English nobility, and even sometimes helped them find brides. So he was the first to realize that what needed to be sold was not art, but rather social status. His motto was simple: there is a lot of art in Europe, a lot of money and empty houses in America. I help them meet. Modern dealers, although they no longer arrange marriages, operate in a very similar way, offering Russian and Chinese billionaires Western status symbols as commodities. And the successor to Duvain's work was the Frenchman Ambroise Vollard. Once a law student, he gave up his studies for art and began his career in 1894. He had no money, but he had ideas. After acquiring a collection of drawings by Monet, he traded them with masters like Degas, Gauguin, Renoir, and Pissarro for their own works. Then he sold 2 paintings by Degas and used the proceeds to purchase several works at once by Cézanne, Gauguin, Van Gogh, and Pissarro. Vollard was the first to give young artists a chance. It was he who organized the first solo exhibitions for Picasso, Cézanne, Gauguin, and posthumously Van Gogh. He accepted paintings as commission, collaborated with foreign collectors, and contributed to Russian patrons Sergei Shchukin and Ivan Morozov becoming owners of many Impressionist masterpieces. After the revolution, these collections formed the foundation of the Pushkin Museum's holdings in Moscow. Another innovation introduced by Vollard was grouping works by little-known artists under the brand from the Vollard collection, as well as sending paintings to international exhibitions in the USA, Russia, and Japan. He published catalogs, promoted new artists, and established standards that dealers still use today. In 1939, his life was cut short under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported at the time that he was killed by a falling bronze statuette. But there were rumors of a darker version involving Corsican competitors. In any case, at the time of his death, Vollard's fortune was estimated at $15 million, and the majority of that wealth came from just one deal. It was the purchase from a destitute Cézanne of 250 of his works at 50 francs each. Some of them were later sold for 40,000 francs, and today their combined value is measured in the billions. The next generation to carry on this tradition was the Italian banker Leo Castelli, who opened a gallery in New York in 1957. He selected artists intuitively, convinced that true art could only come from a vibrant personality. His early discoveries, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, turned out to be remarkable. They were followed by Cy Twombly, Claes Oldenburg, and Jim Dine. And his collaboration with Jasper Johns was especially successful, instantly turning the Castelli Gallery into a brand. He was one of the first to start paying his artists a monthly stipend so they could focus on their creative work without worrying about making ends meet. And by the way, the culture of patronage of patrons who supported artists was very characteristic of feudalism, and this became the main factor in the decline of classical art, which requires months or sometimes even years to create. And without external funding and guaranteed sales, artists could not afford to paint such complex works. They began creating more and more quick, vibrant paintings that had a better chance of being sold. So in 1960, Castelli offered a young artist, Frank Stella, who was working as a house painter in Brooklyn, $300 a month for 3 years. Castelli supported his protégés even during periods of creative crisis when they weren't producing anything, and he wasn't afraid to exhibit works that might have seemed unsellable. And so over the centuries, from Damian to Castelli, times changed, countries changed, artists changed, but the essence of the matter remained the same. A dealer didn't just sell art, he shaped culture, influencing the taste of an era in which great names were being established. If Castelli was the king of the art world in the 20th century, then Larry Gagosian is his successor in the 21st. He started out modestly, selling posters in Westwood, Los Angeles. But in 1979, when he opened a gallery across from Castelli in New York, he showed that he was playing for high stakes. His first major deal was the sale of Piet Mondrian's Victory Boogie Woogie for $10 million. Newhouse is the owner of Condé Nast. Gagosian didn't just sell art, they created a frenzy. When collectors Burton and Emily Tremaine refused to sell him a Bryce Marden, he kept calling until Mrs. Tremaine finally gave in. Castelli would never do that, he smirked. By the 2000s, Gagosian was already ruling the art world. His galleries in New York, London, Beverly Hills, and Rome had become temples of contemporary art. He represented Hurst, Koons, Serra, as well as the estates of Warhol and Liechtenstein. When Charles Saatchi bought Hearst Shark for $12 million, it was Gagosian who brought the buyer and the artist together. But his true legend was the Jean-Michel Basquiat project. In 1983, an unknown, untrained artist moved into Gagosian's bungalow in Venice, together with a then up-and-coming singer named Madonna. 6 months later, Basquiat was already exhibiting at Gagosian's, and within a few years, his works were selling for millions. Another type of player in the art market is the gallery. A gallery in the world of contemporary art is not just a store, it's more like a luxury boutique. Only instead of handbags, there's scandalous installations and paintings covered in splotches. Take for example the White Cube Gallery in London, where none other than Damian Hurst began his career. This gallery didn't just hang his works on the walls, it was building a myth. Press releases, participation in biennales, loud parties, all of this created the aura of a rebellious artist, the very same Hurst who once preserved the tiger shark in formaldehyde and sold it for $12 million. A gallery and a dealer are to an artist what a producer is to a performer. They need to be smart and patient and know how to skillfully build their artist's brand. And then the millions will start flowing in. For example, paintings are often expensive not because there are many of them, but on the contrary because there are so few. The gallery deliberately creates scarcity. Let's say an artist paints 20 canvases, but only 5 are released for sale, while the rest are kept in storage for the future or only for museums. And the irony is that for a wise gallery owner who thinks long-term, money isn't the main thing. Even if you're a multimillionaire, that doesn't guarantee the gallery will sell you a piece. Why? Because for the gallery, it matters where the artwork ends up. If the collector is a respected curator or a museum owner, it raises the artist's status and therefore their future value. For example, at the Marian Goodman Gallery, they refuse to sell Gerhard Richter's works to certain collectors simply because they participate in auctions too often, which means they might quickly resell the pieces. In general, galleries can't stand auctions. Everything there is too transparent. You can see the real prices, the demand, the declines, and most importantly, if a work doesn't sell at auction or goes for too low a price, it damages the artist's reputation. That's why many galleries ask collectors not to put works up for auction for 5 years, or they buy them back at auctions themselves to prevent the price from dropping. If you've ever tried to find out the price of a work in a gallery, you've probably heard something like, "We haven't decided yet. Are you a collector or just interested?" Prices in galleries aren't about math. They're more about psychology. For one client, a work might cost $150,000, for another $90,000. And it all depends on how the gallery has assessed you. Are you a reliable buyer? Will you bring in new clients? Will you lend the work for exhibitions? So that's how galleries and dealers operate. But how else can you identify a popular artist? As they say in the art world, a true artist is not only someone who paints, but also someone whose works are shown at the world's leading art fairs. Art Basel, Frieze, TEFAF. Participating in this is like taking part in the Cannes Film Festival. If an artist is on the list of participants, if a participant is there, it means they're at the top. If not, they're forgotten. That's why galleries invest huge amounts of money to promote their artists specifically there, in front of the press, critics, and billionaires. But when talking about galleries, it's important to understand that at the very top of the art Olympus sit branded galleries like Gagosian and White Cube. There are only about 20 of them in the entire world. They represent the elite Hurst, Koons, Warhol, and behind this monopoly lies a harsh reality. These names make up only 1% of all artists working today. The remaining 99% are forced to fight their way through a multi-tiered system that frankly resembles an art world version of the Hunger Games. But the highest prizes are set at auctions. The most significant sales happen there. They are discussed around the world, written about in the press and talked about on television. And when the lights dim in the room and a work of art appears under the spotlight, it's not just an auction that begins, it's a performance. On stage, it's not just the painting, but everything connected to it. The artist's name, the gallery's reputation, the exhibition history, and of course the magic of the place. And if it's an evening sale at Sotheby's or Christie's, you're not bidding for paint on canvas, you're bidding for status. What are you buying at a Sotheby's auction? Robert Lacey, the author of a book about the auction house, was once asked. A painting and class. Proof of your impeccable taste, he replied. In the world of contemporary art, that's exactly what matters. the right gallery, the right museum, the right auction, because a painting sold at a Sotheby's evening auction in London sounds completely different than if it were sold at a local gallery somewhere in Cleveland, even if it's the exact same work. Let's take an example. The Japanese artist Onkawara, every day he painted a single picture a date in white letters on a black background. November 8, 1989. No images, just numbers. If he didn't finish by midnight, he would throw it away. In 2006, one of his works was auctioned at Christie's for £310,000. Yes, for white letters on a black background. Why so expensive? Because Kawara's name had already become a brand. He's not just an artist, he's a concept, a phenomenon. And Christie's guarantees that this is no accident. In contemporary art, the price increasingly depends not on skill, but on where it was exhibited, who sold it, and whose collection the work was previously in. The appearance of a brand at any stage, be it a gallery, museum, or auction, instantly gives the work weight. The entire model is built on this. Auctions, museums, galleries, collectors, and artists operate as interconnected brands, increasing each other's value. The highest level of brand magic is the evening sales at Sotheby's and Christie's. Let me tell you a story. In the spring of 2007, the art world held its breath. Mark Rothko's White Center was going up for auction at Sotheby's. This is a painting that had hung for 47 years in the offices of David Rockefeller. The last of the legendary Rockefeller brothers, the 91-year-old banker, decided to part with the canvas he had bought in $1,960 for a modest $8,500. What happened next forever changed the rules of the art market. The auction houses, Sotheby's and Christie's, entered into an unspoken duel for the right to sell the masterpiece. Sotheby's made an unprecedented move. They guaranteed Rockefeller $46 million, even if the painting sold for less. Their competitor, Christie's, which already had two other Rothkos in their catalog, modestly offered $32 million. They thought offering more would be madness. But Sotheby's knew what they were doing. The Rockefeller name added those very magical $10 million to the price. Before the auction, Sotheby's launched a full-scale marketing campaign. The painting was taken to private viewings in London and New York, VIP clients were sent catalogs in white bindings, and books about Rothko's retrospective were given as gifts. In the official lot description, instead of a price, there was a mysterious note: contact the organizers. For a select few, the figure was revealed immediately, $40 million. The evening of the auction was a spectacle. Auctioneer Tobias Meyer made a theatrical pause before announcing the lot. And now, White Center from the collection of David and Peggy Rockefeller. A ripple of giggles spread through the room. Not even Picasso was introduced like that. The starting price of $28 million, $6 million higher than Rothko's previous record soared to $72.8 million in just 2.5 minutes. 6 participants, a $1 million increment, an anonymous buyer, speaking Russian with an auction staff member, everything merged into a single frenzy. Sotheby's earned $16 million on this deal. So we've talked about the key players in the art market, but still, how did it happen that the old masters and art that could truly be called art ended up being pushed out by works that most viewers would rather never look at all? There are quite objective reasons for the disappearance of works by the old masters. Over the past half-century, a wave of museum construction has swept across the world. Cities from Bilbao to Abu Dhabi decided that a museum of contemporary art gives them prestige and guarantees tourists. And patrons decided that it makes their name immortal. Each new building needed to be filled. That's at least 2,000 works, paintings, sculptures, installations, everything was put to use. Art was bought up, donated, transferred to collections, and disappeared from the market forever. Moreover, most of these works will not hang on the walls, but will remain in storage. The world's fascination with contemporary art, which was set in opposition to realism, especially socialist realism, did not come out of nowhere. This was the result of a massive PR campaign and financial injections. Billionaires like the Rockefellers and Guggenheim were the ones who built the first museums to showcase abstract and non-canonical art. They were shaping a new public taste, a new normal. Thanks to their efforts, today emptiness can be sold for $1,000, and a banana taped to a wall can go for $6 and $2 million. And the visitors will walk through the gallery, examining such things, pretending to understand their profound meaning. The second force that removed the art of the old masters from the market arrived quietly. In 15 years, the army of collectors grew 20-fold. People with money and ambition began collecting art with the excitement of hunters. And so they collected, cherished, admired, and then bequeathed their collections to museums. The works disappeared behind thick glass doors into a space beyond competition and buying or selling. In this way, all the best pieces were drained from the market and never returned. At auctions, it became increasingly common to see not masterpieces, but second-tier works paintings with a history, but without spark. Art experts began to discuss not brushstrokes and composition, but provenance and past auction results, like commentators who talk about records rather than the sport itself. In June 2006, Christie's auctioned off Yves Klein's IKB 234. It's a canvas evenly covered with a rich ultramarine blue. There are no subjects, no details, no illusion at all. There is only color. And the price, what do you think it was? $1.8 million. Klein died at 34 and managed to create only 11 such monochromes. And the value lies not in the brushstroke, but in the myth that was created. Today's market pays not for technique, but for three things: the artist's story, the uniqueness of the work, and institutional recognition, especially from museums. That is, if a museum buys something like this, the price of the painting and the artist immediately increases many times over. But in fact, despite the sensational headlines about sales for tens of millions, the art market is actually quite modest by economic standards. There are 17,000 galleries in the world, with 70% of them in the US and Europe. Of course, I'm talking about contemporary art galleries. The average annual turnover of a single gallery is about $650,000, and the entire contemporary art market is around $20 billion. And you know, that's less than Nike's revenue or half of Disney's annual income for the entire contemporary art market. And if, after listening to my story, you've decided to make money by taping bananas to a wall, let me tell you one more thing. Let's take the two main art hubs as an example. They are New York and London. Each of them has about 40,000 artists, meaning there are 80,000 people dreaming of making it big. Out of those, 75 are stars, earning tens of millions of dollars. 300 people make hundreds of thousands of dollars. About 5,000 are represented by galleries, but they supplement their income by working as waiters, designers, or teachers. And the remaining 74,625 people live on hope and at the edge of poverty. And as I've already mentioned, the strategy for building an artistic career in the world of contemporary art is not about learning to draw better than others. No, don't waste your time on that. It's better to be born into a wealthy family, or at least make connections with the sharks of the art business. So we've talked about the sellers, but listen, someone is actually buying all of this. How can anyone in their right mind buy a cow cut in half and preserved in formaldehyde? In a world where wealth is no longer rare, buying a piece of contemporary art becomes not just an investment, but a display of power. Money is like an entry ticket. Real status begins with what you do with it. This is exactly where the Veblen Effect comes in an economic theory that says demand for luxury items increases as their price goes up because they emphasize prestige. So this theory here turns into a living drama, played out before the eyes of the public, curators, and billionaires. Owning a work like Jasper Johns' White Flag is not a matter of taste or aesthetics, it's a matter of social weight. When Michael Ovitz, the former Hollywood agent, hung it in his home, he wasn't just decorating his wall, he was changing his position in the hierarchy of the influential. The painting became a medal, a mark of distinction, saying, "I'm not just wealthy, I'm one of those who shape culture. If you have $1 million, you can buy a new yacht, a country house with a vineyard, or a work by Damian Hurst." The first option will seem too obvious, the second too banal, but the third will earn you respect in the right circles. Because among the elite, art is like a Birkin designer, but only on an Olympian level. It's useless in a functional sense, but irreplaceable as a symbol. When Yusaku Maezawa, former rocker, owner of the trendy Zozo and future SpaceX tourist, paid $110.5 million for a Basquiat piece, he wasn't buying paint on canvas, was buying a symbol, an image, a manifesto of the new elite, where rap, technology, and androgynous sculptures shape cultural capital. The painting became the future centerpiece of the museum. This is no longer just an art purchase, it's the construction of a personal brand. And NFT artist People sold his digital work for $69.3 million. The buyer, crypto investor Metakovan, explained his purchase this way. "We want to prove that digital art is just as significant as Renaissance painting." You get it, right? To buy art means to buy recognition, belonging, and power. Just like how people with less money buy a cup of tea for 600 rubles or a t-shirt for $100. Those who are wealthier demonstrate their status with a Birkin bag or a Patek Philippe watch. In the same way, for the very rich, works of art become a symbol that signals, "I belong to the caste of the few." But status isn't everything. Buying a piece of contemporary art can become part of a well-thought-out financial strategy. In fact, a painting can help its owner avoid paying millions of dollars in taxes. How is that possible? Let's break it down step by step. When a wealthy person buys a piece of contemporary art, they can donate it to a museum. At first glance, it seems like a noble gesture, but it's also very profitable. Here's how it works. A person buys a painting for $1 million. A few years later, its value increases and it's now worth $3 million. He donates it to a museum, and the government says, "Thank you for your generous gift. We'll let you reduce your taxes by as much as $3 million, since that's how much you donated." So the person gets a huge tax break and in fact doesn't even need the painting anymore. It has already served its purpose. And moreover, in some countries, he can even keep it at home for storage, as if nothing has changed. Here's another way. Wealthy people create their own charitable foundations, to which they transfer the paintings. Formally, these works are no longer their personal property, but belong to the foundation. But they themselves manage this foundation. For example, let's say a billionaire has a collection. He creates a contemporary art foundation named after himself, transfers the paintings there, and now they legally belong to the foundation, not to him. But he decides where to exhibit them and to whom to show them. The main thing is that the foundation does not pay taxes, and it can also receive grants from the government. So the person still controls the art, but now enjoys tax benefits as a patron of the arts. In some countries, for example in France, a company can buy a work of art, hang it in the office, and then it will be considered a company asset. And if it's an asset, that means it depreciates and its value can be written off the books. This is called depreciation. As a result, the company reduces its taxes every year until the full value of the painting is written off. And the office looks stylish too. Pretty great, isn't it? Now just imagine that someone buys a work by an unknown artist for $10,000. 5 years later, the artist becomes popular and now the work is worth $1 million. He can resell it and make a profit. He can donate it and get a tax deduction for the full amount, or even use it as collateral at a bank, since now it's an asset, just like real estate, for example. And in fact, all of this is legal. The laws are designed to encourage this kind of philanthropy, support for culture and the arts. But smart and wealthy people have learned to use these laws to their own advantage. So what's the catch here? Very often, no one ever sees the paintings they're kept in storage. And some of these donations look rather suspicious. The museum receives a work of very questionable quality, but the donor writes off millions. Valuing art is a very subjective matter. If you're part of the art world, you can essentially set the price yourself using galleries, dealers, and advertising. All those things I described earlier. And even if you're not a big player, you can still ride the wave of rising prices. One of the reasons why art prices have skyrocketed is the unprecedented concentration of wealth. In the US and the UK, the share of income held by the richest 1% has doubled since the 1980s. In France and Italy, it has tripled. In Russia, the gap between the ultra-wealthy and everyone else is 50 times greater than in Europe. According to Forbes, as of 2025, there are 328 billionaires in the world. And in 2007, by the way, there were only 946. These people buy football clubs, penthouses in London, and of course art. For them, masterpieces have become an alternative currency, and cash transactions are the norm. But here's the paradox. Despite the headline-making auction records, art is an extremely inefficient investment. Let's take a notoriously infamous example. In 1990, the Japanese tycoon Ryōi Saito bought Van Gogh's portrait of Dr. Gachet for $82.5 million. At that time, it was a record. He also bought Renoir's Bal du Moulin de la Galette for $78 million. Just a year later, the market collapsed. At Sotheby's auctions, 41% of the lots went unsold. And prices for Impressionists only returned to their 1,990 levels by 2005. So an analysis of the entire art market shows that 20% of the top artists of 1,990 became cheaper over 15 years, and 40% stayed at the same level. Only 40% increased in price. And, art consultants love to talk about Picasso's Boy with a Pipe. After all, it was bought in 1950 for $30,000 and sold in 2004 for $104 million. That means the growth was 16% per year. But it's very rarely mentioned that other works from the same collection yielded less than 10% annually. Manet's Grand Canal sold for $12 million in 1989, went for only $10.8 million in 2005. Degas' Bronze Dancer, bought for $12.4 million in 1999, was resold in 2004 for just $5.5 million. And on average, according to economists' calculations, works of art yield only 1.6% annual return. Simply put, stocks bring in much more profit, but of course you can't hang them on your wall. And here's the truth. 80% of works bought from local galleries will never increase in value. 4 out of 5 lots brought to auctions are rejected even by secondary auction houses. Art funds are collapsing. BNP Bank lost 8 million on 68 paintings, and the Japanese company Itaman lost $500 million. After all, art is a game for the chosen few, a status symbol for the ultra-wealthy, an emotional asset for aesthetes, but it is a poor investment for rational players. So the history of contemporary art is less a story about artists and more about market mechanisms, branding, and the power of intermediaries. Warhol with his soup cans and art factory, Hurst with his platinum skull and army of assistants, these are just the most striking examples of how an idea becomes a commodity and art turns into a tool for capitalizing on names. For the most part, contemporary art has ceased to be art in the classical aesthetic sense. It has become an arena where what matters is not skill, technique, or depth of content, but the ability to provoke a reaction, to surprise, to sell, and to end up in the right hand. It does not exist on canvas, or even in the concept itself. It lives in a certified void, like that very I Am by Salvatore Garau, with which we began. A shark in formaldehyde, urine on metal, dots on canvas wall. Of these are nothing more than symbols of how the art market has long since shifted from art to the market itself.